The moment you stop giving a woman constant attention, something shifts inside her almost immediately. At first you won't see it. She may act completely unaffected, calm, distracted, maybe even colder than before. But beneath that surface, her mind has already started reacting to your absence in ways she probably doesn't fully understand herself. And that reaction is never random. That's the part most men miss. They think ignoring a woman is just another dating tactic, a game insecure people play to gain control. But the truth goes much deeper than that, because when someone who used to give consistent attention suddenly becomes distant, it creates psychological tension the human mind naturally wants to resolve. Especially in relationships, especially when emotions are involved, women are highly responsive to emotional patterns. They notice consistency, they notice energy, and the second the energy changes, their attention shifts with it. That's why a woman who seemed completely comfortable before can suddenly become curious the moment you pull back. Not because she's irrational, not because she's playing games, but because uncertainty creates emotional movement. And emotional movement creates focus. See, when you're always available, always responding instantly, always watching her stories, always reaching out first, your presence slowly becomes expected, familiar, predictable. At first, predictability feels safe, but over time it removes tension from the connection. There's no mystery anymore, no emotional risk, no space for anticipation. She already knows you'll text her, she already knows you'll respond, she already knows your attention belongs to her. And once someone becomes emotionally certain they won't lose you, they often stop noticing your value the same way they once did. That's when the dynamic quietly changes. Most men respond to this shift in the worst possible way. They feel her pulling away, so they chase harder, more messages, more effort, more emotional energy. They think if they can just prove how much they care, she'll reconnect emotionally. But in reality, desperation only speeds up the emotional distance she was already feeling. Because attraction rarely grows under pressure. It grows in space, in uncertainty, in moments where someone has time to actually feel your absence. And the second you stop overextending yourself, her mind begins filling in the silence on its own. Why did his energy change? Why isn't he reaching out like before? Did I lose his attention? Those questions begin quietly at first, almost invisible. But the longer the silence lasts, the louder they become. And this is where psychology starts taking over. Human beings naturally place higher emotional value on things that feel less accessible. It's why people miss things they once ignored. Why absence can suddenly make someone recognize emotions they barely acknowledged when you were constantly there. Your attention had become part of her routine. Now that routine is broken, and suddenly she notices everything that disappeared with it. The messages, the reactions, the consistency, the emotional reassurance. What used to feel normal now feels missing. That absence creates emotional friction inside her mind. At first, she may try to explain it away logically. Maybe she tells herself you're just busy. Maybe she assumes you'll come back tomorrow with the same energy you always had. But when that doesn't happen, curiosity slowly turns into emotional tension, because now she can't fully read you anymore. And when a woman can no longer predict a man emotionally, her focus naturally shifts toward him again. This is why many women start subtly watching from a distance once they feel your withdrawal. She checks your social media more carefully, pays attention to whether you viewed her story, notices when you stop liking her posts. Even your silence starts communicating something. And the strange part is, the less you try to force her attention during this stage, the more aware she becomes of your absence. Because now your energy feels different, more controlled, more distant, less emotionally dependent on her reactions. And whether she admits it or not, that change affects the way she sees you. Suddenly, you're no longer completely predictable, no longer emotionally easy to access. And that creates a kind of tension she can't instantly resolve inside her own mind, which is exactly when her behavior slowly begins to change in ways most men never expect. Because once your attention disappears long enough, she stops focusing only on your silence and starts focusing on what that silence means. That's when the emotional shift becomes personal for her. Your absence no longer feels like a temporary change in behavior. It starts feeling like emotional distance, and the human mind naturally struggles with losing access to something it once felt secure about, especially when that access used to feel guaranteed. Think about it this way. When a song is constantly playing in the background, eventually you stop noticing it. It becomes familiar, expected, almost invisible. But the moment it disappears, the silence feels strange. Suddenly you remember how much emotion that song carried without realizing it before. Your attention works the same way. The good morning texts, the reactions, the consistency, the little moments of reassurance she quietly became accustomed to. Once those things vanish, she becomes far more aware of their emotional value than she was while receiving them every day. And this is where things become psychologically interesting, because your silence doesn't only make her miss you, it also changes how she sees herself through your eyes. Women are deeply affected by emotional feedback, especially from someone they're attracted to. When a man who once gave steady attention suddenly becomes distant, it creates questions she can't immediately answer. Did his feelings change? Did I lose his interest? Was there someone else? Did I overlook something important? And the more unanswered questions she has, the more mental space you begin occupying. That's how emotional focus works. People become consumed by what they can no longer fully explain. At first, she may try to resist those thoughts. She may distract herself, stay busy, pretend your silence doesn't matter. But internally, the uncertainty keeps growing because uncertainty naturally creates emotional tension. And eventually, she starts craving the one thing she once took for granted: your attention. Not because she suddenly became dependent on it overnight, but because human beings instinctively notice the absence of emotional consistency once it disappears. Especially when that consistency carried comfort, validation, and connection. That's why many women begin subtly reaching back out during this phase. Not directly, not emotionally vulnerable yet. Usually it starts small, a random reaction to your story, a casual, "Hey, how have you been?" an inside joke brought back out of nowhere. On the surface, it looks insignificant, but underneath it, she's trying to measure something important. Does she still affect you emotionally? Can she still access your attention the same way she used to? And how you respond in those moments changes everything, because if you immediately rush back with the same energy, the emotional mystery disappears instantly. The tension collapses. She feels emotionally safe again in the old dynamic. But when you stay calm, when you respond without desperation or emotional urgency, her curiosity deepens. Now she starts realizing this change in you may actually be real. And that realization forces her into reflection. Because absence creates perspective in ways constant presence never can. When someone is always available, people rarely stop to fully evaluate their value. But distance forces reflection. It creates room for memory, comparison, and emotional awareness. That's why she begins replaying old moments in her mind. The conversations, the way you carried yourself, the confidence you had before things became emotionally complicated, the energy that drew her toward you in the beginning. And slowly, the version of you she stopped appreciating becomes visible to her again. Meanwhile, something even more important is happening beneath the surface. The emotional roles are beginning to reverse. While you've pulled your energy back, she's leaning forward emotionally. She's analyzing interactions she barely thought twice about before, wondering if there was a moment everything changed, questioning whether she misread your value while she still had your attention freely. And the more time passes, the more emotionally significant your absence becomes in her mind, because psychologically, scarcity increases perceived value. Human beings naturally desire what feels uncertain, rare, or difficult to keep. Once your attention no longer feels guaranteed, it starts carrying emotional weight she didn't feel before. Now even small things become meaningful. She notices when you don't view her story, notices when you stop reacting, notices the emotional space between you growing wider, and that space begins creating urgency inside her. You might see it through subtle behavior changes, liking old photos, reaching out over small excuses, referencing old memories, trying to recreate emotional familiarity without openly admitting she misses it. But underneath all of those small actions is one deeper fear she may never say out loud. The fear that you're no longer emotionally waiting for her anymore. And once that possibility becomes real in her mind, that's when her behavior starts becoming even more revealing. Because the moment a man becomes emotionally difficult to predict, curiosity takes over where certainty used to live. And curiosity is powerful. When she no longer fully understands what you're thinking, when she can't tell whether you still care, whether you've moved on, or whether someone else now has your attention, her mind naturally starts searching for answers. That's what mystery does. It creates emotional tension the mind wants to resolve. And the more she thinks about you, the deeper that tension grows. Without realizing it, the dynamic has already shifted. You're no longer the one chasing clarity or attention. Now she's the one trying to reconnect with something that suddenly feels uncertain. That shift affects her more than most men realize, because once a woman feels your emotional energy pulling away, she often begins trying to restore the connection in subtle ways first. Maybe she suddenly becomes more visible online. Maybe she posts things she knows will catch your attention. Maybe conversations feel warmer again, more intentional. Not because she consciously planned every move, but because emotionally she feels the distance now. And distance changes perception. What once felt guaranteed suddenly feels fragile. What once felt ordinary now feels valuable. That's why her emotions eventually begin overpowering the logic she tried using to stay detached. At first, she may have convinced herself your silence didn't matter, that she could move on easily, that your absence would fade with time, but instead, the opposite happens. The more uncertainty grows, the more mentally present you become, because now it's no longer just about missing your attention, it's about needing to know whether she still matters to you the same way you once mattered to her, and that internal conflict creates emotional intensity she can't easily ignore. But this only works when your silence comes from strength instead of manipulation. There's a difference. One is childish withdrawal meant to punish someone. The other is quiet self-respect. A man who understands his value doesn't beg for consistency. He notices energy shifts, stays grounded, and protects his peace instead of fighting for crumbs of attention. That energy is rare, and rare things naturally become more attractive. Over time, the emotional pressure inside her keeps building. Pride tells her to stay distant. Emotion tells her to reconnect. That tension is usually when her behavior becomes more direct. Late-night messages, unexpected memories brought back into conversation, small emotional openings she normally wouldn't allow herself to show, and beneath all of it is one deeper motivation. She wants to feel emotionally close to you again before the distance becomes permanent. Because your absence created a void she didn't expect, not just in routine, in feeling. Now even ordinary moments remind her of what changed, and instead of replacing that feeling, her mind keeps circling back to you. That's the power of emotional contrast. When you were always available, your value became easy to overlook. But once your energy disappeared, she finally had something to compare it against. Silence instead of connection, distance instead of reassurance, uncertainty instead of emotional security. And suddenly, the version of life where you were present starts feeling heavier in hindsight. But this is where discipline matters most, because the second she reaches back out, most men lose themselves again. They rush, overreact, drop every boundary they spent weeks rebuilding. And in doing that, they accidentally communicate that nothing truly changed inside them. But a man who actually grew from the experience moves differently. He stays calm, warm but composed, open but not emotionally desperate. He doesn't rush to recreate the old dynamic because he understands something important now. Attention given too freely loses emotional weight. So instead of chasing the connection, he allows her to meet him halfway. He lets her actions reveal her intentions. And when a woman invests emotionally on her own, when she chooses the connection instead of simply receiving it, the attachment becomes far deeper and far more real. That's the difference between temporary attention and genuine emotional investment. And even if she never fully returns, something still changes inside you through this process. You stop measuring your worth through someone else's consistency. You stop abandoning your standards just to avoid losing someone. You realize that emotional peace is more valuable than temporary validation. And that realization changes every relationship you'll ever have afterward, because the real power was never in making her chase you. It was in becoming the kind of man who no longer needs to chase anyone to feel valuable. And strangely enough, that's often the exact moment people begin seeing your worth the clearest. Not when you're trying to prove yourself, but when your silence finally proves you already know who you are.